Hello, welcome to a re-recording of our Wednesday night service, our Wednesday night Bible class, where we're looking at the history of the church. As of now, we're looking at the end of the second century and the early third century, and we'll be transitioning at that point to go into the third through fifth centuries in the next couple of lessons. But unfortunately, when we went over this in our Wednesday night live class, the live stream wasn't working, and so several have asked, could we record it and put it online? And the answer to that is, of course. So I'll have the PowerPoint up here that maybe you can follow along, and I'll be talking. You won't be able to see me in any video, at least, but that's probably a good thing, don't you think? Okay, let's get into the history of the church here around the end of the second century. When we looked last time at the history of the church in the early second century, moving through to the end of the second century, we noticed two things most particular, and that is the Roman government did not view Christians in a favorable light, and the pagan populace did not view Christians in a positive light either. And so Christians were persecuted very early on in a number of different ways by a number of different groups of people. And one of the things that we can see here from this graffiti, it's called the Alexamenos Graffito. It's found in Rome, and it dates to the middle to the end of the second century, if memory serves me right. A couple of things to break down here. The first would be the inscription. The inscription reads Alexamenos Sebete Theon, which is Alexamenos, which is this guy who is worshiping here. Sebete is worships, and Theon is God. We might say worships his God to make it more translatable into English. And so obviously we have here a person worshiping this object. And the question is, what is this object? Well, the first thing I notice is this is something on a cross. This is something that is being sacrificed. This is something that is, or maybe not sacrificed, but something that's being put to death in a criminal offense. So the crucifixion was not invented by the Romans, but it was perfected by the Romans, and it was the death of the common criminal. We might think today of something like lethal injection or the electric chair, something like that. Well, in the days of the Romans, it was crucifixion. But we also notice that it's the body of a man, the arms of a man, that is being hung on this cross. There's nothing spiritual about this. If you are familiar with Christian icons, there's no halo, there's no wings, there's no coloration to denote anything. It's just the body of a man. But then the body of the man has a head of a donkey, and that may be the most insulting of all of this. I don't think I have to tell you what the head of a donkey represents. In fact, even today, if we see someone who is acting a fool or being kind of dumb, the crude way to talk about that person would be to call them a dumb you-know-what. And that's the idea here. I'm not trying to be crude, but that's the idea, is that the pagans in Rome could not understand someone worshiping a human being, first of all, and a human being who died on a cross. Because it's all shameful. Everything in this image is shameful. And so this inscription, this graffiti, is so helpful to us as students of history because it shows exactly how the general population viewed Christians at such an early time. So let's go back to what we ended with previously, which was the attitudes towards Christians from pagans. So how did the Christians' neighbors and friends and family view them when they were converted to Christianity? Well, as we might expect, some of these pagans had philosophical objections to Christianity. Here are three among many, but these are three of some of the most popular. And they would say things like, well, if Christianity were true, why did it come so late in human history? It's a good question to ask, because to a pagan, the more ancient the religion, the better it was. In fact, that's one of the reasons why Roman and Greek pagans did not force the Jews to convert to their way of thinking, to their religion. And that's because Judaism is just as old as Greco-Roman religion, at least to some degree, right? You go back to the 1500s BC with Moses, even further than that with Abraham. And so you have a very old tradition in Judaism. But Christianity, this idea of worshiping a human being who died on a cross, like, if that was true, why did it come so late in human history? Why not have the ability to save everyone in human history? That's a good question to ask. Number two, couldn't Jesus have just worked the miracles by magic? One reason we believe Jesus is the Son of God is because he had extraordinary powers to which he could perform miraculous things and give the signs and wonders, as the Gospel of John states. And the question is, if he did that, how do you know that that was from God? Couldn't it have been just regular magic? And we have to bring our minds to the 1st and 2nd and 3rd centuries here, where, for example, in Ephesus had a library. You can still see the ruins of it today. And the majority of the scrolls in that library were magic spells. And so people would actually go to the library and try to learn these magic spells so that they could perform these healings and these rituals and things like that. Well, what makes Jesus different from those? And then number 3, isn't an immortal soul better than a resurrected body? Well, the reality is that the Bible teaches in a bodily, physical resurrection that will come at the return of Christ. Platonism, which comes from Plato, obviously, the Greek philosopher, taught that all spirit is good and all material is bad, and therefore, because the body is material, our spirit is trapped by the prison of the body, and death is the release of that spirit, and that we should all be longing for the release of our spirit to go back to join the universe, which unfortunately is how a lot of Christians today think about death. I have been to very few funerals where we actually talk about the hope of resurrection, a physical bodily resurrection. Now, 1 Corinthians 15, of course, is the great treatise on the physical bodily resurrection, and Paul even says there, what's planted is perishable, what is raised is imperishable. We will be raised in the likeness of Christ, and you think about what that means. Well, when Christ was raised, he had the ability to eat food. He did so with Peter and John on the shore. He had the ability to walk and to move from place to place in a finite way, like with the men on the road to Emmaus. But he also had the ability to pass through walls without opening doors. So what does that all mean for us in our resurrection? To be quite honest, I don't know, and I don't pretend to have all the answers. But I do know there's going to be a physical bodily resurrection in the same way that Christ was raised. We don't teach that. What we teach, unfortunately, is that we have a soul that goes off to a big ball of light, and we exist in some big ball of light in heaven forever. But that's not what Scripture teaches. Scripture teaches in a resurrection, and that's what we have hope in. Now, so these are the objections. How would Christian apologists answer these questions? Well, they all had various answers, but they come down to these 3 basic tenets to each question. So the first question, if Christianity were true, why did it come so late in human history? The answer to that is, well, Jewish prophecy leads to Christianity. Okay, so Judaism is very old, and if you understand the Jewish prophets, they point to Christ. And so Christianity is not so much its own thing as it is rooted in the teachings of Judaism. Okay, so question number 2, couldn't Jesus have worked the miracles by magic? Well, suppose he could, but here's how you know the miracles are legitimate, at least in the mind of these Christian apologists. When someone does something miraculous, they usually ask for credit, worship, or money. We see that even today. There are people who claim to have the ability to heal miraculously, but they do it for fame, they do it for money, they do it for glory, and a lot of those have been proven false, right? So Christ doesn't demand credit, he doesn't demand worship for doing any of the miracles. In fact, in the Gospel of Mark, when Jesus performs a miracle, he says, don't tell anyone. We call this the Markan secret in academics. And so Jesus tells them, don't tell anyone. And of course, they obviously run off and tell people, but Jesus wanted it to be kept secret. So there's another problem. If you were doing it for magic and you were doing it for your attention and not for the glory of God, we would expect Jesus to make money doing this or want everyone to know about it, but that is not what you read about in the Gospels. And then finally, as we mentioned earlier with the resurrected body, the resurrected body speaks against Platonism. And so it's not so much that the Christian apologists argued for the goodness of a resurrected body, although they did. They saw the flaws with Platonism and highlighted those. So Christian apologists, we're very lucky to have them, very blessed to have them, because they did not have the gift of brevity. And that means that we can really look at what they taught and evaluate it objectively. Some of these apologists of the 2nd century and on into the 3rd century had their work cut out for them. There are many of the apologists, which apologist comes from the Greek word apologia, which just means a defense. So these are people who defended the Christian faith against all different kinds of threats. And so the apologist's job was to defend their belief and acceptance of the Christian faith. How did they do this? Well, the first is they used Greek philosophy. Now you say, well, why would they use Greek philosophy to argue for Christianity? It's the same reason, and I say this all the time. If you're going to argue with someone, you better know what they believe. Well, the best apologists were Greek philosophers before they became Christians, or schooled in Greek philosophy at least before they became Christians. So they used Greek philosophy against itself. They were like good lawyers. They found holes in the argument and pointed those out. They also used rhetoric. Now, rhetoric is just the standard of speaking, how you communicate your message. I've mentioned this on Wednesday night when we were going over this the first time, but I love preaching. I love preaching at Salem Creek and wouldn't want to do anything else. But I also love getting the invitation to go to other congregations and preach to them. And I think you all could understand that I do not preach the same way at Salem Creek that I do at a 25-member rural congregation. The audience is different. And because the audience is different, I have to know my audience and communicate a message that my audience will understand. As I said on Wednesday night, I talk a whole lot less about Greek and Hebrew at the 25-member country congregation. Right? And it's nothing against them. It's just I know my audience, and I know what's going to work for them. So the fact that these apologists knew their audience and were able to communicate in a way that their audience would understand is very important. And then finally is allegory. Allegory is taking something literal and making something spiritual from the literal. So the example that I give is some of these Christian apologists would argue about baptism, and they would say, well, you see baptism all through the Old Testament. We're like, wait a minute, do you? Is baptism for the forgiveness of your sins there in the Old Testament? No, not necessarily. But they would say, well, the waters of creation is a reference to baptism. When Moses strikes the rock and water pours out from it, that's an example of baptism. That's allegory. Nothing in the text tells us that. There's nothing in the New Testament that tells us that. It's a spiritual meaning to something literal. And so that can be a problem, but the early apologists used that to their strengths. Let's talk about a guy named Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr is perhaps the most important, most influential of these 2nd century apologists. He was raised and trained by a plethora of philosophers. Justin was a Gentile. He was schooled in many different types of Greek philosophy, which is very interesting because usually you are only schooled in one type of Greek philosophy, but he was schooled in several. And he converted to Christianity because he did not find an acceptable answer to any of life's questions from these other philosophical ways of thinking. And so for Justin, Christianity was the only way to answer those difficult questions. And there are 3 philosophical questions that must be addressed in life. One is, where did I come from? The second is, why am I here? And the third is, where am I going? Those 3 have to be answered. And for Justin, Christianity was the only one that can answer those. And I would argue, too, that Christianity is the only one that can answer those 3 questions sufficiently today. Now, when Justin had his apologetic battles, he was unlike many other 2nd century apologists because he fought everybody. Justin was a fighter, and he was like an MMA guy. He knew all the different styles, and he used them to his advantage. So he had these apologetic battles against pagans, people who believe in the gods of the state, let's say. He had it against Jews, and he had it against heretical Christians. So Justin was very influential because he had a lot to say to a lot of different audiences. One surprising thing is that Justin gives considerable attention to the demons. He attributes the demons to pagan gods. Now, we might reference here Deuteronomy 32 and verse 8, which is the passage that refers back to Babel in the book of Deuteronomy. It says that at Babel, God gave of the sons of God, the divine council, to each nation. And that there is a divine rebellion where those members of the divine council rebelled against God and accepted worship for themselves rather than worship to God. And so that seems to be theologically the origin of demons and pagan gods. We can study about that perhaps at a different time. But for Justin, I think he understood, it's not so much that he discredited these gods as he understood these gods to be evil forces in the world, and perhaps we can give Justin his due there. Okay, let's transition now and talk about two heresies in the early church. A heresy is anything that goes against orthodoxy. And so what we're doing here is we're establishing what did the church believe and what was the church not willing to compromise on. Well, we first have to start with a guy named Marcion of Sinope. Marcion opposed the Jewish roots of Christianity, and that caused him to create a totally different Bible. It caused him to teach totally different things that really align more with Gnosticism than Christianity, which we'll talk about Gnosticism in just a few moments. But Marcion began his life and his career as a pretty good Christian. He was wealthy and he used his money for the church. He donated a great sum of money to the church in Rome, but when it was found out the doctrines that he was teaching, the church in 144 refunded his money. And he was rejected by the church. Now, I told the Wednesday night class I find this absolutely hilarious because I've never known a church for any reason to give back money. But maybe that's something we should look at. Are we to accept money given to us that is given by perhaps evil motives, right, or false teachings? It's something worth our time to think about. So because Marcion was basically excommunicated from the church, this prompted him to begin his own church. We do not know anything from Marcion himself. Really, all we have is what his critics wrote about him. One of those critics who wrote a work called Against Marcion is named Tertullian, and Tertullian called Marcion a mouse who gnawed the gospel to pieces. Now, why would Tertullian say that? Well, Marcion took out the entirety of his Old Testament. He rejected the entire Old Testament. Why? Because he opposed Judaism. And he viewed the God of the Old Testament as a God of wrath and as an evil God, and the God of the New Testament in Christ, a good God full of grace and mercy. And he believed the two were totally separate and opposed to one another in sort of a dualistic sense. Because he opposed the Jewish roots of the Bible, when you come to the New Testament, he opposed all the Judaism in the New Testament. And so the only New Testament gospel that he accepted was the Gospel of Luke. Well, why is that? Well, Matthew is a Jew who wrote his gospel to the Jews. Mark is a Jew, and John is a Jew. The only Gentile gospel is the Gospel of Luke. And as I mentioned Wednesday night, there is a lot of research coming out in scholarship now to suggest that Luke probably was a Jew. The only reason, historically, that the Christian tradition suggests that Luke was a Gentile is because Luke was a doctor and he was a historian. Well, the reality is a Jew could be a doctor and a Jew can be a historian. So those aren't really good reasons at all. And when you look at the language that he uses and his familiarity with the Jewish calendar and Jewish ritual, it seems like he has a background in Judaism. Now, that's neither here nor there, but Marcion accepted Luke as a Gentile and accepted his gospel for that reason. Also, Luke was a companion of Paul, and he viewed Paul as the only true apostle. So he only accepted 10 of the 13 letters of Paul. So that'd be Romans through Philemon. He rejected the pastoral epistles. The pastoral epistles are 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus. A lot of people today still reject the pastoral epistles, claiming that they're written by someone other than Paul. But I think there's good reason to believe that Paul wrote them. And again, that's another conversation for another time. Now, we do not have this book, but Marcion wrote a book about the contradictions between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Like I said, we don't have the book in existence today, but what we do have is Tertullian's refutation of that book, which is called Against Marcion. You can go online, Google Against Marcion by Tertullian, and you can read it in an English translation for free. But like I said, these church fathers did not have the gift of brevity, so make sure you have kind of a good chunk of time stamped out for your day when you do that. The reality is, we find that Orthodox Christianity had things they weren't willing to compromise. And one of those was the Jewish roots of the New Testament and the Jewish roots of Jesus, to which Marcion did reject, and he was considered a heretic. Now, what did Marcionism look like? If you were a follower of Marcionism, what did that look like? Well, as we said, you believe only Paul was a true apostle, because Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles. All physical relations are immoral. That means basically sexual relationships, even within marriage, are immoral. So, as I mentioned Wednesday night, I find it funny that all of these movements died out because they weren't procreating, right? You weren't raising up any children in these movements. And so those all those were considered immoral. Any type of alcohol was considered immoral, and so water replaced wine in the Lord's Supper. The water there was used just to avoid alcohol. And this obviously goes against the teachings in Scripture where fruit of the vine is what is to be used. Jesus took 2 of the 5 elements in the Passover and attributed them to represent himself. And so Marcion rejected that because of the alcohol content. As such, he also rejected the eating of any type of animal flesh. Fish was the only type of animal product that was allowed to be eaten. You could only be baptized if you were unmarried. And as I said earlier, because the church rejected Marcionism, that meant that the church understood that there were some uncompromisable things. We can't do without the Old Testament. We can't do without the oneness of God and Christ, the God of the Old Testament and Christ in the New Testament. There's nothing wrong with being married. There's nothing wrong with sexual relationships in marriage. There's nothing wrong with eating animal products. Jesus declared all foods clean. You need to partake of the fruit of the vine, wine in this case, in the Lord's Supper. And those are things that we were unwilling to compromise. And we should be unwilling to compromise, even today. Okay, let's transition here to talk about Gnosticism. Gnosticism is a huge problem in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, but it begins as a problem in the late 1st century. The Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, Jude, Revelation, 1st and 2nd Peter, perhaps others, arguably Galatians and 1st, 2nd Thessalonians could be argued for this. But arguably, all of those books teach against Gnosticism. So Gnosticism is obviously an early movement. It is, however, difficult to say with certainty what Gnosticism is. Gnosticism is not a religion. It is more of a movement. And so it's not so much a system of organized religion. It's more of a movement within religion. And so it's very difficult to say what Gnosticism is, just like it's difficult to say what Christianity is. If I ask you what's Christianity, the question then might be, well, are we talking about Catholicism, Eastern Orthodox? Are we talking about Protestantism? And if we're talking about Protestantism, are we talking about denominational Protestantism? Are we talking about Lutheranism? Are we talking about the oneness of the church? What are we talking about? Well, that's the way Gnosticism is. But Gnosticism had a few specific tenets that were taught throughout all veins of Gnosticism. The first is that you can only be saved if you have an experiential knowledge rather than factual knowledge. So let me put this into maybe modern terms. If you've read the book Muscle and a Shovel, you will know this to be the case with the author of that book. The author of that book went to a Pentecostal church and supposedly was saved, but the problem was he could never be truly saved until he had the ability to have some kind of miraculous gift. And everyone kept trying to get him to speak in tongues, and he was unable to do it, and so he was not truly, completely saved. Well, that's an experience, right? That's experiential knowledge. And I mentioned this Wednesday night, and I don't mind mentioning it here because I believe it to be scripturally true. I do find it interesting that in the holiness movements, speaking in tongues is the spiritual gift that is used the most. You have very few people who claim to have the spiritual gift of healing or the spiritual gift of prophecy or things like that, and actually have that to check out and be true. And perhaps the reason is because the spiritual gift of speaking in tongues might be the easiest to fake. I'm not saying that anyone is faking it, but that might be a reason. And it's an easy experience to have. I do think it's interesting, though. 1 Corinthians 12, 13, and 14 all say that speaking in tongues is the least of the spiritual gifts. Okay, that's neither here nor there, but it's something to consider. Gnosticism worked the same way. You can only be saved if you have an experiential knowledge, meaning you have a secret knowledge that was given to you by God that nobody else has. And it's your job now to share that with everybody. Now, in Orthodox Christianity, you are saved based on factual knowledge, meaning you know factually that sin exists. You know factually that you are a sinner. You know factually that Jesus lived and died and was raised again, resurrected on the third day. You know factually that his blood cleanses you from sin. You know factually that there are things you have to do, like repenting and being baptized, in order to receive that salvation. Those are factual things that you know. And so Gnosticism taught that wasn't enough. You had to have this experiential knowledge. Gnosticism also taught that there are two gods. There's a creator God, which is the God of the physical, and that should say God of the physical, not good. And there is an evil God, that the creator God is evil, rather. And there's one saving God who is the God of the spiritual, and the spiritual is the good. So you have creation, physical things which are evil, and a God over that. Spiritual things, and saving God, which is good. Physical is evil, spiritual is good. That's basically what you need to know. Because of that, all flesh is inherently evil, and all spirit is inherently good. And because of that, they deny the incarnation of Jesus. Because for God to take on flesh would mean he's inherently evil. And that obviously doesn't work with their theology. And so they would say things like, Jesus possessed a man, or God possessed a man named Jesus, that God never actually died, that the flesh died, but God did not actually die. And they would reject the resurrection as a physical bodily resurrection in that sense. And so they believe, like Platonism taught, that the soul is trapped in the prison of the flesh, and that it longs to be released and join its divine source. We know most about Gnosticism through the Nag Hammadi Library. The Nag Hammadi Library was discovered in 1945 in Nag Hammadi, Egypt. This area, Nag Hammadi, Egypt, was a trash heap. And, of course, archaeologists love trash heaps because we get to see the treasures that people threw away. And so when we call it a library, it's not a building, it's a collection of books, right? Like our Bible is a library of 66 books. This collection is a collection of 13 books, but these 13 books contain over 50 texts. Among them are two pseudepigraphic gospels, and these gospels are probably familiar to you. There's the Gospel of Philip and the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas is probably familiar to you because every Christmas and Easter we read about and hear from National Geographic and the Discovery Channel about the lost books of the Bible, and the Gospel of Thomas is usually one of those. So let's talk a little bit about the Gospel of Thomas and what it is. It's really not a gospel. A gospel comes from the Greek word euangelion, which means good news. In a literary sense, the Gospels like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are very biographical. And so we read about the life and the actions of Jesus. That's what the Gospel teaches us. And it is the good news. But the Gospel of Thomas presents not a biography, but 114 secret sayings of Jesus. Now, when you read it, some of these things are things that sound like something Jesus might have said. it might match a little bit what we know from Jesus in the Gospels. However, there are others that do not match the sayings of Jesus in the Gospels at all. In fact, it's just weird that anyone, let alone Jesus, would say something like this. And so my favorite to talk about is the very last one in the Gospel of Thomas. This is saying number 114. It says, Simon Peter said to him being Jesus, let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life. Jesus said, I myself shall lead her in order to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every woman who will make herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, I do not believe that for a second that Jesus would say something like this. The emphasis here is that she will become a living spirit, right? Because all spirit is inherently good, all flesh is inherently bad, and here we have a problem with the flesh. Her being a woman, her flesh being less than that of a man, at least according to the Gospel of Thomas. And so in order to fix her, we have to change her spirit by changing her from having a female spirit to a male spirit. It's very weird, very, very weird, and I do not believe for a second that Jesus would ever say something like this, particularly because at the end of the Gospel of Mark, it is the testimony of Mary, whether this be Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of Jesus, or whatever. It's the testimony of Mary that is the single most important testimony ever given in history. It's her message that was brought back to the apostles that showed the resurrection of Jesus. And that's important because a woman's testimony was considered worthless in a court of law. It was inadmissible in a court of law. So I do think that it's important for us, especially those of us who might view females as lesser in senses of equality in religion, to realize that the message of the resurrection came first through women. Now, God has specific roles for men and women in His church and in marriage and in life, but that does not mean that one is greater than or less than the other. It just means that we have different roles that we are called to fulfill. So, again, back to this point, I don't think Jesus would ever say something like this. So, we'll end with this. What was so wrong with Gnosticism? Why was it considered a heresy by the early church? Well, Orthodox Christians concluded that Gnostics were heretics because they denied 6 fundamental doctrines of Christianity. And here are those 6. Number 1, Gnosticism denied the identity of the Creator God as the same as the Supreme God. And when we read the Bible, obviously in Genesis 1, it is the Supreme God. It is the God of the heavens and the earth. It is the God of Israel. It is the God of the church in the New Testament who created all things. And so there's not a separation, and Gnosticism denied that. Number 2, Gnosticism denied that that there's goodness in the created order of the universe, because all physical things are evil in the realm of Gnosticism. But when you read Genesis chapter 1, God creates all these things, and He calls them good, and then at the end, His crowning achievement, mankind, He says it's very good. And Gnosticism denies the inherent goodness of creation. Number 3, they denied the full incarnation of Christ, because Christ was man and God, and man is flesh, man is physical, man must be evil, and you cannot have evil and good indwelling together. And so they denied the incarnation, and they had a number of ways of doing that. We just don't have time to talk about it right now. Number 4, they denied revelation in historical events, because revelation was to come in experience. Revelation was to come right through the divine experience, the divine knowledge that you were given. They denied redemption by the blood of the cross, because that would require a human to die. Blood, obviously, is physical from the body of Jesus, and so they denied that. And they denied a resurrection body. Okay, so because the flesh is evil, and so the spirit longs to break free. Well, that's all we have time to talk about right now, and look forward to coming back on Wednesday, and hopefully the live stream will be working then. Thank you for your patience with this. I'm enjoying this study. I hope you are too. When we come back on Wednesday, we will be looking at the 2 schools of biblical interpretation, the Alexandrian school and the Antiochian school, and we'll have a lot of fun doing it. Okay, I hope you have a blessed week, and look forward to seeing you on Wednesday.